College in Winter Park, Florida. He's a specialist in 17th century philosophy, especially that of Spinoza. But lately, most of his research and publishing has been in the area of medical ethics. In addition to teaching and research, he sings in the Bach Festival Choir. Please welcome Dr. Tom Cook.
Thanks very much. It's nice to see you guys again and to feel the spirit of this place. It's a beautiful morning out there. Thanks for coming here and not going to the beach. The highway from Orlando to here was crowded with folks going to the beach this morning, as you well might imagine. Well, I won't talk too long, so there'll still be time to go to the beach if you so choose. It's nice to be back again. Last time, or I think the penultimate time, next to last time I was here, I was talking about a philosopher from the Hellenistic period, the ancient world, named Epictetus. For some reason, people seemed interested in Epictetus, and the service leader, program coordinator suggested, well, you're into those Hellenistic philosophers, so why don't you come talk about Stoicism? Actually, I don't know very much about those ancient Hellenistic philosophers. My specialty is the 17th century, especially a guy named Spinoza. But the Stoics are kind of different because they have been around and have been profoundly influential on the Western philosophical tradition from their own time to the present, and especially in the Renaissance and in the 17th century. My guy Spinoza is deeply imbued with the wisdom, especially the ethical wisdom of the Stoics. So I'm not too far out of my bailiwick talking about the Stoics. But I think the other reason people were interested in hearing about the Stoics is that they're having a moment for some reason right now out there in the popular culture. Just last night I took 10 minutes on Amazon and all of these books popped up, published in the last 3 years on Stoicism. Stoicism is having a moment. That's interesting, and part of what I want to think about this morning, why would it be the case that Stoicism is having such a moment today? And is that a good thing or not? An article, a headline I saw last night on the web, is Stoicism the cure or is it a symptom? I think that's a really interesting way to pose the question. Is Stoicism going to be therapeutic for us, or is the very fact that people are turning to Stoicism a sign of serious pathology? So this is the most colorful of all the slides that I'll have to show you today, because as the service leader pointed out, it's hard to come up with images that say something about Stoicism. I love that smoky thing you had. I wish I'd had that. I'd put that in the background for all of my text-focused slides here. But Stoicism for teens. The Daily Stoic. How to be a Stoic. Journal like a Stoic. I'm not sure what all that means. Maybe some of it will be clearer as we go along. But not only books. These are podcasts, all of them which have come into being in the last 2 years, all of them about Stoicism, and this is just a subset of the ones. I love the one on the left top there. The Street Stoic, combining Stoic philosophy with hip-hop lyrics for daily inspiration. The Gen Z Stoic. At any rate, Stoicism is an ancient philosophical school, and like so many ancient philosophical schools, it has its roots in Socrates. Socrates, you will remember, was the short, dumpy, snub-nosed, bald, ugly, pain in the neck who hung around the marketplace in Athens asking people questions. And he was such a riveting personality that everyone who heard him had something to say about him. Unfortunately, the Athenian people, the main thing they had to say about him was, let's get rid of this gadfly, he's a pain. And they convicted him of impiety and corrupting the youth and executed him. But those who heard him speaking in the marketplace were so profoundly moved and interested in this guy and in what he had to say that we can trace the roots of 3 or 4 different philosophical schools in the Hellenistic period, which is the period right after the classical age of Athens. We can trace them back to Socrates, to that guy. With Stoicism in particular, we don't have very much in the way of sources written by the Stoic thinkers who founded the school. We have this guy, Diogenesis Laertius, who wrote centuries later the lives of the eminent philosophers, and he tells us a lot about the founders of Stoicism and what they had to say, but we don't have their own works. We have a couple of works by a student of Epictetus. We have Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, his journal, and that's about all we have by way of original sources. But we think we know some of them. Oh, and Seneca, who was a Roman Stoic, who wrote a lot of letters which have come down to us, in which he articulates his understanding of the Stoic vision. But most of our knowledge comes from Diogenes Laertius. So Socrates was such a complex and interesting guy that Plato, the most important philosopher in the history of the West, focused on the questions that Socrates asked. Socrates would find someone in the marketplace and say, "You there, tell me, what is justice?" And they get in a conversation, and Socrates would show them that they didn't understand what justice was. And in the process, he made it clear that he was seeking to define the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be just. And Plato thought that's what we ought to be doing. That's what philosophy ought to be about. And so Plato investigated these questions at great depth in a series of dialogues, in every one of which, except for one, Socrates is the main participant in the dialogue. So Plato wrote this unbelievable tribute to his teacher, Socrates, in the form of a series of dialogues in which Socrates is interested in these questions. What is virtue? What is justice? What is piety? What is courage? What are these things? And we got the Platonic Academy and Plato, and that's probably the most important of the schools influenced by Socrates. But there were other aspects to Socrates' personality that really grabbed people's attention as well. Not only was he interested in these abstract questions, what is virtue, what is justice, he lived a very simple life and a very modest sort of life, personally. So we have stories of him when he was serving in the military, that he had great strength of character. When everybody else retreated, he stood his ground and rallied the troops, and the Athenians wound up surviving the battle after all. But he was poor. He owned basically nothing. He looked down upon those who seemed so interested in consumerism, we would call it today, in accumulating goods. And he thought we shouldn't be interested in the sorts of things that so many people are so interested in. And this had a deep influence on a group of philosophers called the Cynics. The cynicism didn't mean then exactly what it means today, although you'll see a connection between the Cynic school and what we call cynicism. But this guy named Antisthenes was a friend of Socrates, and he thought that the main lesson of Socrates' philosophy was live simple, live natural, live according to nature. Don't get caught up in the societal frou-frou that constitutes commercialism and consumerism and search for fame, etc. So Antisthenes founded a school called the Cynics. The principle of which was we should distinguish between those desires which are important, which we need, and those which we don't. And we should take our lead from the animals. Because the animals get what they need, and they don't seem to want or care about much other than what they need. So we can take that as an example for ourselves and live according to nature, taking nature to be the way the animals live. You can see this is not going to go far in Athens, which was the most sophisticated, educated, economically developed city in the ancient world. In addition to Antisthenes, who founded this school, a famous representative of the school is Diogenes of Sinope, and Diogenes Laertius, different Diogenes, who wrote the lives of the eminent philosophers, was obviously fascinated by Diogenes of Sinope and tells story after story after story about Diogenes of Sinope because he was such a character. So he didn't have a home. He lived in a broken olive jar outside the walls of Athens and couldn't understand why anybody would bother to build a home when you could get a free broken olive jar and live in it. He used to beg from statues. And people would say, Diogenes, what are you doing begging from statues? He says, well, I'm just trying to train myself. I'm getting used to being refused when I beg, because I know people are going to refuse me quite often. I'm trying to get used to it so I won't be so upset. And this is I hesitate to tell this in a church, but this is a story I can't tell in the classrooms of Florida anymore, so I'll tell it in the Unitarian Church. Diogenes of Sinope said we should distinguish between those desires which we can't do without and can't get rid of, and those which we can do without and get rid of. And we should get rid of all those that we can and satisfy those desires that we can't get rid of in the easiest way possible. So, for example, he lived in a jar. He needed shelter. You got to have some kind of shelter from the Athenian sun. So he lived in the broken olive jar outside the walls. You gotta eat. The easiest way to satisfy your desire to eat, he figured, was to beg, so he was a beggar. Hard to just dismiss sexual desire, so as you can imagine, he satisfied this in the easiest possible way. He masturbated in the square, downtown Athens. And people came up to him, Diogenes, really, aren't you going a little far here? Isn't this a bit much? And his response was, I only wish I could satisfy my stomach just by rubbing on it. That's such a great story, and I can't tell it anymore in the classrooms, even a private college in Florida. Anyway, that's the Cynics. You'll see the connection between them and the Stoics in a second. The Cyrenaics we won't go into except to mention that they were what is called a hedonistic school of philosophy, believing that this search for pleasure is the highest desire of human beings, and ultimately they led to the Epicurean school that I talked about a year ago, whenever it was that I was here talking about that. And finally we get to the Stoics, who are having a moment now. The Stoics they take their name from a porch on the Acropolis. A stoa means porch in Greek. And the Stoics hung out there on the painted porch, it was called, and Zeno taught to the folks around him. Like I say, we don't have very much in the way of primary literature from the Stoic thinkers of the time. Zeno left nothing. We have a couple of one-sentence fragments that Diogenes Laertius mentions, but otherwise we have nothing from him. Epictetus, who my classical scholar friends tell me should be pronounced Epictetus, but I find that difficult to remind myself every time. At any rate, Epictetus, we do have writings from a student of his, and we think that these are pretty much transcribed from the talks that he gave, so we think we have some primary source material from Epictetus. Marcus Aurelius wrote Meditations while he was on campaign, and Seneca, finally, a Roman of the 1st century CE, wrote a bunch of letters to a guy named Licinius, and we have those letters, and they articulate the Stoic philosophy pretty well. One of the most interesting things about Stoicism, and what attracts people to Stoicism, is that Epictetus was a slave. Marcus Aurelius was the emperor of Rome. And Stoicism is a philosophy which both a slave and the emperor of Rome could find deeply satisfying and sufficient for their ethical, spiritual direction and needs. And that has seemed to a lot of folks, certainly seems to me, to recommend the philosophy as a way of thought. Now I say a philosophy because all of the Stoic thinkers of the day had sort of moved beyond the traditional religious categories of classical Greece. You read Greek mythology these days in junior high or high school, and you know about Zeus and you know about the various gods and goddesses. The Stoic thinkers didn't take that theology seriously anymore. They were more philosophically oriented than oriented toward traditional religion. But they were looking for direction in life. They were looking for principles in accordance with which they could live meaningfully and happily. And so that's true actually of all of these schools. None of them were traditionally religiously inclined. All of them were looking for what we might think of as a substitute for the kind of moral and spiritual direction that religion traditionally gives people. And Stoicism offered that to Zeno, who's living in the classical age of Athens, Epictetus, who's 2nd century Rome, though he's a Greek, Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, and Seneca. All of these folks across 400 years, 500 years, finding satisfaction in Stoicism. The folks I was talking about. Oh, I like this statue. I told you I didn't have much in the way of pictures here, but this one's interesting. This is a two-faced statue. On one side is Seneca, on the other side is Socrates. A recognition of the extent to which the Stoic school, like so many of the ancient philosophical schools, were inspired by and to some extent modeled upon Socrates himself. Stoicism itself has three categories that interest it. They talk about logic, and we won't go into that here, although it's, in addition to Aristotle, the only sort of systematic school of logic we have from the ancient world. Aristotelian syllogistic logic, Stoic logic, and that was logic for 2,000 years until basically the 19th century. They were interested in physics, and they had very characteristic views of the natural world around us. According to them, we can think of them as materialists because they didn't think there exists anything other than the material world. But that's a little misleading because they believe the material world to be ensouled, that the material world has a living principle of order, structure, and even rationality in it, in light of which it's ordered, structured, and we can understand it. Call this the world soul. It's providential in the sense that it wants things to work together and work out. Wants is a little wrong-headed here. It's not like it has desires like us human beings. It's the world soul. But it orders things and makes it possible for us to understand things, and we'll come back to its importance in Stoic Ethics. They are determinists, meaning they think every event has a cause, and that cause, given that cause, only one effect can follow. So they are strict determinists in that philosophical sense. They are even fatalists in the sense that they believe that there is a predetermined order in which things are going to occur, and that can't be changed. And finally, the last element of their physics, and I don't know where they get this from, except they think it makes sense, that everything that's happening now is going to happen again. And it's going to happen again endlessly, endless number of times. We're in one of these cycles, and it will end, and another cycle will begin, and the same things that are happening now will happen just as they are happening now again. And one of the tests, and this is something you fans of Nietzsche will recognize, he picks up from the Stoics, is can we live our lives in such a way that we love the fact that it's going to happen again, just like it happened this time, rather than, oh God, don't let it go that way again. Amor fati, this is called, the love of one's fate, if one can embrace one's life and one's fate to the extent that one is willing, indeed happy, to have it happen all over again, then that's a test for good things. But what ethics is known for, what Stoicism is known for is not logic or physics per se, in the modern world certainly, but Stoic ethics. And that's where we come into the recent moment that Stoicism is having in our contemporary culture. And the ethics have two aspects I want to talk about. We'll come back to the Cosmo theological. For the moment, I just want to talk about the rational eudaimonistic aspect of Stoic ethics. Eudaimonistic, what does this mean? This is a term from Aristotle, from the ancient Greek world, which Aristotle focused on. Eudaimonia means, we usually translate it these days as happiness. But it means more than happiness. It means flourishing, human flourishing, prosperity, self-actualization, whatever those positive terms we have for human fulfillment. Eudaimonia is that. Literally it means, by the way, having a good demon. But we translate it as human flourishing, satisfaction, prosperity, happiness. And according to Stoic ethics, human beings want to be happy. This is not a surprise. Everybody wants to be happy. And Aristotle recognized this too. The question is just, how do we achieve the happiness, the satisfaction, the flourishing that we're looking for? And the Stoics have their own answer to that question. Let me focus for a minute on Epictetus. Epictetus, remember, was a slave. He was freed at age 40, I think, and lived the rest of his life freely and taught philosophy. But he wrote a book called the Enchiridion, which translates as the Handbook, and this is the Handbook of Life. I have a sort of a personal back up from that. First sentence of the Enchiridion: there are certain things which are within our power and certain things that are not. That sums up half of Stoic ethics. Recognizing that some things are within our power and some things are not. And some of you will recognize this as basically the serenity prayer from the 12-step programs, right? God grant me the serenity to accept what I can't change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's Stoicism in a nutshell. The Stoic philosophy, as Epictetus summarizes it, is get to know things, get to know the nature of things, get to know how things are, get to know what we can expect from things, and recognize that don't have it in our power to make things produce what's not natural for them. So adjust, the way he puts it, in order to be happy, we have to get our desires satisfied. There are two ways we can do that. We can change the world to bring the world into sync with our desires, or we can change our desires to bring our desires in sync with the way the world is. Now, which of those is going to be easier? Changing the world or changing our desires? And to Epictetus, this is a no-brainer. We have our desires are under our control, he says. Why he thinks that is another question, but he claims our desires are under our control, the world is not. So if what we're looking for is a match between what we want and the way the world is, what we need to do is bring our desires into sync with the way the world is. To do that, you have to study the world, and it helps to practice, he says. So he says, think about life as if it were a banquet. If you're at a banquet, you don't immediately demand that they send you the best dishes first. You sit there, you wait till things come across your plate as they're passed around the table. You take what you want and eat, and you pass on the plate, and you're satisfied. That's the way we should be with life, Epictetus says. Think of it as a banquet. Things are coming our way. Let us be grateful for the good ones, the good things coming our way. Yeah, you might ask, but what about the bad things coming our way? He says, well, know the way things are. He says, you remember the Olympics were a big deal, and winning the Olympics was a big deal, and wrestling was a big sport in the Olympics. So Epictetus says, you want to be an Olympic wrestler? Okay, think about what that involves. It involves training every day. It involves a very strict diet. It involves going out and wrestling other sweaty, smelly bodies on a regular basis. It involves doing this for years in preparation, and the chances of your emerging the victor in the Olympics are maybe 1 in 100. That's the way it is. Are you good with that? If you're good with that, okay. Embark on a career of trying to be an Olympic victor in wrestling. But be clear on the fact that that's what's involved in trying to be an Olympic wrestler. And you have to be willing to do all of that and fail, or you're going to be disappointed. And you say, okay, I'll be disappointed. This is actually a big deal for the Stoics. Disappointment is a perturbation of spirit, they say, a perturbation of soul. When we're afflicted by certain emotions, lust, greed, anger, wrath, envy, you'll notice there's a remarkable similarity between these and the cardinal vices of the Christian church. There's a reason for that historically. These states of mind, these emotions, are perturbations of soul, and real human eudaimonia, real human happiness, consists in equanimity of soul, what the 12 steppers call serenity. So don't set yourself up for perturbation of soul. Don't set yourself up for disappointment by expecting things to be different from the way things are going to be. So find out the way things are going to be and adjust your desires and expectations to the way things are going to be. Then you'll get what you want, because you didn't want anything except that which you were going to get. This is, again, Stoic wisdom in a nutshell. He says, you want to go to the baths? Good. Nothing wrong with going to the baths. Just remember what it's like at the baths. It's hot, and it's smelly, and there are pickpockets, and there are other folks who pee in the pool, and there are assistants who don't bring you the towel on time. There's all of this going on. That's the way the baths are. If you're going to the baths, you want to take a bath, that's fine. Just remind yourself that's how the baths are. And then when the baths turn out to be that way, you won't be disappointed. One more, and this is the hardest. He says, you own a cup. Remind yourself, a favorite cup that you love to have coffee or tea in the morning. Remind yourself, it's a cup. And cups are breakable. And if accidentally one morning in your morning stupor you drop it and break it, you won't be so upset, because you've been aware that this is a cup, and cups break. And if you embrace your spouse or a loved one, remind yourself you're embracing a human being, and human beings are mortal. And if that spouse or loved one dies, you won't be so upset, because you've reminded yourself all along, this is the way reality is. This is the way people are. Human beings are mortal. Says, what, you want your loved one to live forever? What, do you want to be married to a cyborg? He thinks, if we're realistic, if we keep our desires in accordance with nature, we'll never be disappointed, we won't be upset, and we'll develop mental and spiritual and ethical fortitude, which is another of those important terms in Stoicism, fortitude, because it takes strength to manage one's to be willing to endure and accept what reality has coming our way. Outline of the general ethical view here. I've spoken of the discipline of desire. I say it's based on physics because you gotta believe the world is the way it is and it's gonna run the way it's gonna run, and it's helpful to know how it's gonna run and how it is in order to bring your desires in keeping with the flow of the world. But he says it's also important discipline of action. This is the closest they come to what we think of more as sort of ethics. They sum up this view as philanthropy, philanthropia, but it doesn't mean philanthropy exactly as we mean philanthropy, though you can see the etymological connection. It means literally love of humankind, anthropos, like anthropology. Love of human beings, philanthropos, philanthropy. And did I include a quote from Marcus Aurelius here? Yeah, this sums it up. This is from Marcus Aurelius. Men exist for the sake of one another. Teach them then, or bear with them. We can't do without each other. We are social beings. We are rational beings who like to discuss things. You can try to make the folks you live with better, so they'll be easier to deal with and easier to live with, or you're just going to have to bear with them. Now, I remind you, the guy writing this is the Emperor of Rome, who has the power of life and death over every citizen and every alien in the empire. But he thinks to himself, the best thing I could do is teach my fellow men and women so that they would be better company, because I can't do without human company. And if I don't teach them and make them better, I'm going to have to live with them the way they are. And that's not always so good. So back. So this is more Epictetus, training oneself to desire what the universe allows and not to pursue what it doesn't allow. That sums it up. It requires the virtue of courage, the courage to endure what the universe is going to throw our way without complaint and misery and whining. And temperance, where temperance means ability to control one's own desires, self-discipline. These are traditional virtues in the Greek world: wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. And the Stoics focus on those two, the virtues of courage, fortitudo, and temperance. One more wrinkle to this. According to the strict Stoic doctrine, let's say, the only thing good for a human being, an individual human being, is his or her eudaimonia, happiness. The only way to ensure happiness, again, is to have one's will in consonance with the way the world is and the way the world's going to be. And the only way to have that happen is to know something about nature and to adjust one's desires to reflect and be in sync with what nature's going to be like. So the only real good is to be had through self-control and fortitude and the virtues of the individual Stoic. And this is the extreme version of the doctrine again. The view is you can have that kind of satisfaction whatever circumstances you're in, however miserable they seem. So Epictetus was a slave, right? There's a story that his master was angry at him for some reason, I forget why, and had his arm tucked up behind his back, pushing on it really hard. And Epictetus says, "Master, if you push much harder, that arm's going to break." And the master was angry and kept pushing, and Epictetus says, "You're getting close, master." And shortly thereafter, with a loud crack, Epictetus' arm broke. And Epictetus said, "As I said, master, if you push harder, that arm's going to break." Now That's supposed to reflect the equanimity of a Stoic. You know that arms break when they're pushed that far. You know that slaves are not in a position to physically resist the discipline that their masters are foisting upon them. And so you address your wishes. What does he want? He wishes his arm were bionic, that it were made of iron, that it didn't break. He's a human being. Part of being a human being is having arms that break. And that's supposed to be an example of the way in which the Stoic can maintain equanimity, maintain serenity of spirit, maintain eudaimonia, even in the worst of circumstances, when your arm is being broken by your master. So, again, according to strict Stoic doctrine, nothing is really good or bad except those things which are within my power, and that's only my own intellect and my own desires. Everything else in the world, poverty, wealth, good reputation, bad reputation, health, sickness, all of those are things outside of my power, and they are technically, in Stoic terminology, indifference. Indifferent, TS, indifference. They're not essential to one's well-being, one way or the other. You can be satisfied, content, happy, flourishing in the worst of circumstances or in the best of circumstances. The circumstances don't matter. And that's the main point. That's the extreme version. Later Stoics realized this was asking a lot of people and distinguished between not good indifference and bad ones, because that would be too strong, preferred indifference and dispreferred indifference. I'd rather have health than sickness. Sickness is not going to disturb my equanimity. Sickness is not going to make me miserable, but I'd rather be healthy than be sick. I'd rather have money than be dirt poor, but poverty is not going to disturb my equanimity. So then the later Stoics were working out what that means in detail to embrace the idea that some indifferents are preferred and others dispreferred, and yet neither of them can destroy one's virtue, one's equanimity, neither of those can perturb one's spirit. Now, this is the basics of Stoic ethics here. Realize the world can be a wonderful place and a hostile place. Realize that how one does in terms of one's own satisfaction, happiness, is a matter of how one deals with what's coming one's way, whether it be good or bad, and that equanimity can be maintained to the extent that we maintain control over our desires and don't desire things that are unrealistic. Don't desire things that we can't be pretty confident we're going to get. And train ourselves even, practicing by begging from statues if you're Diogenes, by reminding yourself when you drink from your cup that it's breakable, or that when you embrace your spouse, that your spouse is mortal. We can practice keeping our desires in line with the way things are. And we should practice in those ways. Now, I mentioned back earlier the Cosmo theological dimension of Stoic ethics. I want to mention that just in passing here at the end. The Stoics believe that reality is suffused with different terms. God, Zeus. They're not serious about Zeus, not the Zeus of the mythology. Reason, the Logos, Nous. Sometimes they talk about flame. I don't know why they talk about flame. But the world soul is a rational soul. That's the point here. And there's an order to this world, and surely they're right about that, right? We couldn't have science if there weren't some order to the natural world for us to ferret out and understand. according to the Stoics, it's coming to realize that there is that order, and that we too have a spark of reason, rationality in our own souls, and trying to bring into sync, as it were, the rationality in our own souls and the rationality in the cosmos as a whole, so that we recognize and embrace the way in which and the extent to which we are parts of that whole, and our reason is part of the cosmic reason, and we escape the surly bonds of our individual selfhood by becoming part of something greater than ourselves. This is not the dominant school within Stoicism, but it's an important one. And I bring it up here because almost all of the current enthusiasm, revival of Stoicism in popular culture is focused entirely on the rational eudaimonistic aspect of Stoic ethics that I mentioned earlier, this Epictetean view that we need to adjust our expectations to the way the world is and maintain equanimity of spirit. That's what you find in this Stoic revival that's going on now. Cognitive behavioral therapy, Stoicism. Reality therapy of a certain kind, Stoicism. It's even certain versions of Christian therapy these days are Stoic in origin, Stoic in roots. And this is possibly a good thing, because in a world in which things aren't so much in our control, it's valuable to remind ourselves that things aren't so much within our control, and that if we set ourselves up for misery, disappointment, and frustration by wanting things to be other than the way they are and are going to be, we'll be miserable. That's good. But this headline I saw last night that said, is Stoicism the cure, or is Stoicism the symptom? I thought was really interesting. Why did Stoicism have such a moment in the ancient Roman world? Think about the Roman Empire, right? There's an emperor, Seneca, for example. We mentioned Seneca. He was the tutor and the advisor to the Emperor Nero. Nero was a sadistic nutcase. And there were worse, Caligula. Think of the other emperors of Rome at the time. They were absolute dictators, tyrants. They had power of life and death, and they were cruel, and they were erratic, and they were sometimes foolish. And in a world like that, the suggestion is, by historians, you'd expect a doctrine like Stoicism to arise in a world in which you feel like you don't have very much control over your life. You don't have very much control over the political realities. You don't have very much control because there's this hierarchical, utterly tyrannical political system with the emperor at the top. In a world like that, you're looking for solace, you're looking for shelter, you're looking for a way to find peace in a chaotic and violent and threatening world. So the suggestion of that headline I mentioned, are folks feeling like they're in that kind of world again? A world in which they're not much in control, in which somebody else is calling the shots, or worse yet, the shots are working out naturally in ways that we have no control over. And in a world like that, folks are looking for solace, looking for shelter, looking for peace, looking for security. A security that can only be had by withdrawing within and working on oneself as opposed to working on the world. Which brings me to my final point, I promise. A very often heard objection to Stoicism is that it's a doctrine of quietism. Meaning, if you're a Stoic, you can be happy in a just society, you can be happy in an unjust society. So if you can be happy in a just society and in an unjust society, why bother to make your society more just? If Martin Luther King had been a Stoic, would we still have Jim Crow in the South? if the important revolutionaries and freedom fighters in human history had been Stoics, would they have bothered? The people I know who call themselves Stoics say, yeah, sure. But they'd have gone into the fight realizing that they were unlikely to succeed and that it was going to be tough, and in the case of Dr. King, that he was likely to get murdered. But being aware of all of that, they would have sure joined the fight, because arguably justice is a preferred indifferent over injustice. Better than injustice, even though one can be, as a Stoic, satisfied in an unjust world. I don't know. You guys tell me. Is it the case that a Stoic would have no incentive to try to make things better, to try to change the world? Or can you be a Stoic and nonetheless go out on the barricades? Your story this morning of your friend whose house was burned down is a poignant reminder of what happens if you don't push back. Can you really put your heart into pushing back if you realize this isn't really within my power? This is a tricky knife edge to walk. And it's interesting to me that at this moment, Stoicism is having such a revival in its rational and eudaimonistic aspect, not so much in the Cosmo theological, although maybe some of you are, well, there are movements in contemporary culture that Unitarians would be more likely to be aware of than traditional fundamentalist Christian fellowships, for example. A kind of embrace of the cosmos, a kind of attempt to remind oneself that one is part of something larger, some natural world, some infinite reality. But that would take me into the 17th century and into my favorite guy, Spinoza, which I'd love to talk about, but didn't come here to talk about today. I came here to talk about Stoicism today, so I'll stop and would be interested to hear what anybody else has to say about Stoicism and its prospects as either symptom or therapy for our miserable 21st century society. Are we done, or do we talk among ourselves?
We usually get together after and talk under the tree. We have a place where we have coffee.
Okay, good.
If you'd like to stay,
I would like to stay for 20 or 30 minutes because I have to drive to North Carolina this afternoon. Yes, ma'am.
Can I ask one quick question?
Please.
Could you give a quick 10 words or less definition?
Of Stoicism?
Jeez, 10 words or less. What about 12 words?
The view that human happiness is to be found through control of one's own desires and courageous endurance of what fate brings one's way. Is that one sentence? These are the three.